Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.
And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Michuta.
And welcome everybody, Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo. And I'm your host and sensei for this hour, Gary Michuta, mild-mannered apologist. Both day and night, it's just I'm always engaged in this, always learning more about the faith and sharing more. And it's so much fun, and it's so great to be with you. Thank you so much for tuning in. Got a great show in store for us today because we're going to have our good friend Matthew Swaim come on the show. Matt, and we're going to talk about his work at the Coming Home Network. He is part of the crew that welcomes former pastors and laity, Protestants. They're on the journey towards the Catholic faith, and many times they have questions and confusions and stuff. And so for us cradle Catholics, it may not seem like a big deal, but for our separated brethren, there's often points of confusion. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about one of those, and that is, what's the difference between a Catholic priest and a Protestant pastor? Well, there's big differences, but there's also some similarities too. So Matt Swaim's going to be coming up on the other side of the break. And we're going to discuss that. That's going to be a lot of fun. It's always fun to have Matt on the show. He brings like high energy. I don't know what you say. Just high energy, fun discussion. There's some very interesting insights too into all these different areas of apologetics, conversion, and so on and so forth. I also, want to remind everybody that the Apocrypha Apocalypse has begun. Some of you may be familiar. I mentioned this a couple of shows ago that I have started my own Apocrypha Apocalypse on YouTube. Started my own channel. I guess if you search Apocrypha Apocalypse, it'll show up. And basically, what is it? Well, Protestants call the 7 Old Testament books that are found in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles, but aren't found in Protestant Bibles, Apocrypha. See, we hold it as inspired scripture. They hold it as mere human writings. And so I've written several books on the subject of the Old Testament Deuterocanon because, quite frankly, it is the issue, I believe, the most fundamental issue that separates Catholics and Protestants. It's also one of those issues that a lot of Catholics, a lot of Protestants don't know about. I've written 3 books on the subject. Why Catholic Bibles Are Bigger, The Case for the Deuterocanon, 15 Myths book. But sadly, fewer and fewer people get their information from reading. A lot more get it from videos. So what I decided to do was I opened up my own channel, the Apocrypha Apocalypse, and I decided I'm going to try to take little bits and pieces of this really cool subject and put it into video form, presentations. And so I started out, I'm unrolling episode by episode, a short series I did several years ago. And then I'm going to start producing new material, and we're going to dive deep into the issue of the Old Testament canon. And so I really encourage everybody, if you're watching, I appreciate your support. If you could go to the channel, again, it's called Apocrypha Apocalypse on YouTube, and subscribe, tell people about it, because it's really tough to start out brand spanking new on YouTube. And so anyway, I appreciate your support. And also I appreciate your support, too, with Virgin Most Powerful Radio's programs, not only Hands-On Apologetics, but all the other programs. We certainly appreciate it here if you could subscribe if you haven't to. And if you have, thank you very much. Give a thumbs up, put something in the comment line. All that feeds into the algorithm. And it also helps us have a greater presence online. And that really helps our mission. It helps spread the faith, helps defend the faith, And we appreciate it here. And, God bless you for helping us. Let's see. As always, if you're familiar with the show, maybe there's some newbies out here because we are growing by leaps and bounds. Every episode of Hands on Apologetics, we start off the program looking at an informal logical fallacy. That's a kind of defective way of arguing. So by doing so, when we can spot them, we can diffuse them. And today's Finding the Fallacy is the single cause fallacy. We also are introduced to an early church father in our Meet the Early Church Father segment. Today's early church father is Pseudo Dionysius the Areopagoate. Pseudo Dionysius the Areopagoate. Very interesting early church father indeed. And as you know, I always want to welcome all of you watching live stream on Facebook, YouTube, and all the other platforms. Hi, everybody. It's great to see familiar names out there. And also, I want to welcome all of you listening on radio around the country and via podcast around the world, which is really cool. Welcome aboard, everybody. There's plenty of room in the dojo for all of us to train to become good Catholic defenders of the faith. By the way, you can download any of the episodes. Maybe you're going to miss Matt Swaim or part of Matt Swaim. You want to hear what he has to say on the subject. Just go to our flagship website, which is virginmostpowerfulradio.org. Go up to our shows, scroll down to Hands on Apologetics or any other show you'd like, and boom, you got all our programs right there. And you could download it, you could share it, you could do all sorts of wonderful things with it. If you have a question for Matt, by the way, you can give us a call at 888-526-2151. That is 888-526-2151. And if you want to email something, maybe share something that's going on at work, maybe with a discussion with a neighbor, maybe you have a question on the Deuterocanon, shoot us an email. The dojo mailbox is questions@handsonapologetics.com. And, okay, well, hey, let's jump into the Finding the Fallacy. Today's Finding the Fallacy is the single cause fallacy. It goes by a number of names. It's funny how informal fallacies, they have a lot of AKAs going, also known as. It's also known as the complex cause, causal oversimplification, causal reductionism, reduction fallacy, also questionable cause. At least it fits within a larger category of questionable causes. The single cause fallacy assume that there is a single simple cause of an outcome when in reality it may have been caused by a number of jointly sufficient causes. So something that occurs quite a bit, you find this a lot in broad statements like religion begets violence. You get this a lot with the new atheist. They'll pull things off the news and say, see, there's a riot started by Hindus. And so obviously religion is the root of all evil. Religion causes violence. But that commits the single cause fallacy because although religion may have a role in that particular instance, chances are there are many other causes that contribute to it. It could be economic, could be social, could be racial, could be all sorts of things. And to ignore all other causes and single out a single one is to commit the fallacy for today. So always keep that in mind. By the way, this is also, single cause fallacy is one of those fallacies that's often at work with conspiracy theories. They will try to pull out a single cause, sometimes a very minor cause, and make it the only cause, and try to connect the dots using that. So beware, folks, to, as they say on Jesus 911, was it be prepared is to be forearmed, something like that. It's a great slogan. I should have committed to memory. But anyway, that is our Finding the Fallacy for today, the single cause fallacy. All right, let's jump to Meet the Early Church Father for today, and his Pseudo Dionysius the Areopagoate, pseudepigraphical body of writings purporting to have been authored by Dionysius the Areopagoate, who, if you remember, was baptized by St. Paul after hearing Paul's discourse at the Areopagus in Athens in Acts 17:34. However, the writings were they authentic, by the way. They would belong to the first century of the Christian era. They actually made their first appearance at the beginning of the 6th century. So the earliest quotations from these writings are found by Severus of Antioch, dating from 518 to 528. Severus, a Monophysite, quoted Denis the Areopagite in support of his own theological stands, and it was quickly pointed out to him that none of the older Christian authors have ever heard of any writings by the Areopagite. So the writings, by the way, consist of 4 treatises and 10 letters. The treatises are the Divine Names, Mystical Theology, and the Celestial Hierarchy, and Ecclesiastical Hierarchy. The 10 letters are largely supplementary to the treatises. The terminology, by the way, of all 14 writings is similar throughout, and also quite foreign to the terminology used in the period when they supposedly came. So there's no doubt that all these works are the work of a single author, and was really no doubt that that author is not Dionysius the Areopagite mentioned in Acts. It's actually much later. Initially, these writings received lukewarm reception immediately when the opponents of Severus questioned their authenticity, but they slowly began to gain a reputation, and by the High Middle Ages, they were used as authoritative writings. In fact, many of you may be familiar with St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, where he employs quite a bit of work from Pseudo-Dionysius. And about a century has passed. Basically, many scholars, and you can add a couple more manys to that, have tried to identify the author. No one has been able to make a case that has won the majority opinion. The language and style is peculiar to himself, and there doesn't seem to be any real connection with any other church father. And that's our church father for today, Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. Coming up next, we have our good friend Matt Swaim coming up. We're going to be talking about the past.
If you shop on Amazon.com, there's an easy way to support Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Just visit smile.amazon.com and type in Catholic Resource Center under the desired charity. Now, when you log into your Amazon account and purchase products, a portion of it will automatically go to support Virgin Most Powerful Radio at no cost to you. Thanks in advance for supporting CRC and VMPR. And may God richly bless you and your family.
Pro-life across America, the Billboard people.
Did you know my mom's gonna have a baby?
She is? Will it be a boy?
Or will it be a girl? We don't know yet, but we heard the heartbeat, and my dad said this is gonna be someone very special.
You mean like being a president? Or maybe a doctor?
Well, probably maybe like a singer or dancer, I think.
Hello, my name is Marianne Koharski. I'm the director of Pro-Life Across America. We know that every baby is a miracle and has the potential to do great things. If you know someone who is pregnant or in need of alternatives or assistance, or would like to support the work of Pro-Life Across America, please call 1-800-366-7773 or visit our website at prolifeacrossamerica.org. Pro-Life Across America is non-political and totally educational.
Pro-life across America, the Billboard people.
This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for your support here at Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Here's an easy way to do it. If you're going to sell or buy a house, call Real Estate for Life, 877-543-3871, because they're going to get you a Christ-centered agent to purchase your home or to sell your home. And at the close of escrow, a portion of his commission goes right back to Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Call 877-543-3871. Thank you so much for your support.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody, to Hands On Apologetics. And we're going to talk about, issues of non-Catholics becoming Catholic, and basically, what's the difference between a Protestant pastor and a Catholic priest? Well, to help us sort through that, we have our good friend Matt Swaim. Matt grew up in a strong Christian family, attended United Methodist, Nazarene, and Free Methodist congregations along the way. And while studying media communications at Ashbury College, he discovered G.K. Chesterton, and that led to curiosity about the Catholic Church, which eventually convicted him to join it. He works on Catholic radio nearly a decade before joining the Coming Home Network staff in 2016. His primary role is working to coordinate and promote new videos, web, and other media content, and you could see all his great stuff, great work at chnetwork.org. And here he is, ladies and gentlemen, the man, the legend, Matt Swaim. I should have a recording of cheers.
It's pseudo Matt Swaim. There's no primary documents proving that I am, in fact, the person who's doing all this. There's a lot of scholarly debate on if it's actually me. So just so you know.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. Well, pseudo Matt, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Gary. Glad to be with you as always.
Yeah, we just had your good friend Ken Hensley on, and
of course.
It sounds like you guys are pounding out the videos.
Yeah, we just put one out just a few minutes ago, our continuing discussion on the Reformation doctrine of sola fide, and I know that Ken has been doing some episodes on sola scriptura and sola fide with you, and they're a lot of fun. I mean, Ken's a former Baptist pastor, so he's got all kinds of baggage to dig into.
So hey, the two of you talk about dynamic duo. You both come from, I don't know, is your perspectives very different? I mean, you're more from a Methodist.
They actually are very different.
Yeah, he's more Calvinist Baptist, right?
Yeah, and what's interesting is on that question of faith alone, we might be sort of similar. On the question of sola scriptura, we might be kind of similar, but on how those two things kind of play out, we would be very different. Faith alone, much more so than sola scriptura, in the sense that, Ken, from a Reformed perspective, would have believed ultimately it's the sovereignty of God. There's nothing you can do to achieve your salvation. I would have said that too as a Methodist, but I would also have said that you have to cooperate with God's grace in order to make it, and you could lose your salvation. Whereas he would come from a once saved, always saved background, saying, once you're in, you're in. If you're out, it's because you were never in the first place and you were fooling yourself. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. And this is one of the reasons I always appreciate being invited onto your show, is because you take the time to help inform your listeners that Protestants are not like this single demographic. There are only 30,000 different kinds of them. And sometimes in the single congregation, there can be 2,500 different kinds of them. So
yeah,
it's important to make the distinctions.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you can't treat it as one-size-fits-all arguments. Some things will impact, let's say, a Calvinist, like Ken Hensley was, and some might not have any effect whatsoever on someone like you from more of a holiness movement.
Yeah, a lot of the Catholic stuff made sense to me. There's not that much disagreement on some of the key points of salvation and justification and sin and redemption. I mean, there are a few, but ultimately, it's some people have a little farther to travel to get to the Rome exit. Some people have to do more on the interstates to get there, and some people have to do less. So
yeah, and one of those points, of course, is the pastorate. Protestant pastors, and then you have Catholic priests. And I imagine that's probably a question a lot of people have on their way to Catholic churches. Well, what's the difference between the two?
Yeah, I thought I would maybe today dig into, if you're a Catholic, the idea of a priesthood is fairly normal, and it's hard to kind of understand what a Protestant might think that the person up front, what their job is, what their role is, how they got there, who should be up there. So when I grew up in the Methodist, Wesleyan, Holiness, Nazarene traditions, it was the assumption that you want to be a pastor, you got to go to seminary. And there's an ordination through the laying on of hands, and that's pretty scriptural. The idea being that, Paul lays out some things for Timothy of what you're looking for in a church leader, but you kind of had the extra added aspect of it of you should be able to be a good public speaker. You should be able to be a good administrator. These are things that you make your leadership appealing. What's interesting is that I remember a couple of pastor searches, because in the Nazarene church I went to, we were kind of responsible for selecting our pastor. And the Free Methodist churches I went to, the bishop selected our pastor for us, which is kind of an interesting, dynamic. Some congregations select their pastor, some, depending on the way that it's structured, have their pastor assigned to them. But I remember in one of the pastoral searches, it was, crucial, absolutely essential that this person be married and have a family, in order to pastor our church. Because, as St. Paul says to Timothy, if a man cannot manage the affairs of his own household, how can he manage the household of God? So it was like evidence if you were married and had kids and, that was stable, that you should be, that would be one piece of evidence as to why you might be put in charge of a congregation. What's interesting is that was seen as kind of like a bare minimum requirement. And in a sense, there was sort of like this unspoken mistrust of the priesthood for that same reason. That how is a guy who is not married, doesn't have a family, supposed to run a congregation? Of course, it was also because we had no idea what priests actually did. But there was the sense that, the pastor ought to be able to do these things. And what's, funny but also sort of sad at the same time is there's this whole culture of PKs, of preachers' kids. These guys enter the pastorate and their kids are real small. And everybody's like, what a beautiful family with their 3 kids. And this is amazing to have them here at the church. And then those 3 kids become teenagers.
Yeah.
And the dad's time is like all invested in the church and the kids go nuts. I mean, I'm telling you, if you want to know where the parties were at my Bible college, go find the preacher's kids and the missionary kids, because they were the ones who cut loose. That's not universal, but it is interesting to think about, kind of how that criteria was laid out, at least in my own background. And again, the whole reason that these people were up front is because they had a gift of some sort of leadership. And so the idea was that they should be able to get up and speak, because the primary thing that you take away from any Protestant service is encouragement and edification and some sort of enrichment from the spoken word or the sung word.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was a big part of it.
Yeah, that's primary. I mean, if they can't do that, then they completely failed, because what else is there to do other than light a fire under the congregation and, maybe fundraise, keep it afloat, growing the church. It's funny, Matt. I think there is some truth behind that. It's funny how it's a family may be a criteria for a pastor, but you have this phenomenon of the PKs, and apparently it must be a real phenomenon because there's named PKs, pastor kids, right?
Yeah.
That if it's a criteria, it's odd that these families suffer under a pastorate rather than flower. You know what I mean? If it really is a requirement.
And there's no one size fits all. I mean, a lot of it has to do with the temperament of the kids and the nature of right. the pastor's responsibility. And of course, in some cases, you've got it's the wife who's the pastor of this congregation, because it's not a priesthood that they're looking at. It's a preaching ministry, essentially. And we have that kind of preaching sort of ministry even among Catholic women, right? That they're not priests, obviously, but they have this forum where they speak at women's conferences and to groups. So teaching ministry is something that's a part of that. But it's a lot of people will say, well, if we could just get our priests to be married, and they can have families, then we would cut down all these problems with the priest shortage and stuff. And I'm thinking, I've been in these situations, man. Do you have any idea? You can't get people to give money to the church now. Now you want to give it to a guy to be able to put his whole family in health insurance and get his kids through college and stuff. I mean,
yeah,
it's a different dynamic. It's a different dynamic.
Yeah, no doubt. And there's so many other issues that come about. What happened if the marriage gets in trouble? What happened if
sure. As has been the case in at least 2 churches I've been part of.
Yeah. I mean, it won't solve problems. It actually open up a lot more problems, in my humble opinion. But that's largely because of what I learned not only from you, but other converts as well. It's like you don't know how, having a celibate priesthood is actually very beneficial. You don't know the stuff that we go through, in our old congregations.
That being said, I think it's important, and I'm glad to hear so many vocation directors and even bishops talk more about this, that you shouldn't go into the priesthood because you think you could never be a father of a family.
Right.
And so this is an alternative option. Instead, we want the kind of men to be priests who have that fatherly instinct, who have that parental, drive, because that's what we need in people that we're going to call father. I mean, we need that. And otherwise, if a person has no interest in having a family and that's why they're becoming a priest, or that's a main reason they're becoming a priest, then why are we putting them in charge of this entire family that takes up our whole town?
Right.
It's a kind of a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I don't, what happens is, and this is weird, you might have a child that doesn't seem to have any special skills. They don't seem very social or something. And it's not unusual to hear, well, maybe they have a vocation.
Maybe they got
it's
a
almost
vocation.
like, maybe it'll be a priest or a nun, as if, priests and nuns are those that, aren't successful or aren't, have special charisms or something.
Why was Cain's sacrifice rejected? Because he brought his most rotten vegetables to God.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I mean, are we going to
I
like, well, this
that.
person's not going to really make it anywhere. Maybe they can fake their way through seminary and get a job at some parish somewhere. Like, honestly, like we want, to encourage the best and brightest among us. I mean, that's what Protestants do.
Yeah.
I mean, if you don't have the skill set, then guess what? Bunch of people who have by obligation a sacramental duty to attend your services. They can just go somewhere else if they're like, yeah, that sermon was lame. They can just be gone. So, I mean, this is another major difference between what goes on in Protestant churches and Catholic churches. I think people assume that all Protestant pastors have these like amazing ministries and all these priests are just, they don't have the skill set. Just guess what? There's a lot more Protestant churches than you think they are. And the ones that you're seeing are just the successful ones. I mean, there are storefront churches all up and down the roads of your town and strip malls and, buildings that they bought from other congregations that died out. There are all kinds of these people who are trying and struggling. And, if you look at some of the mainline denominations, some of them have like less than 50 people on a Sunday in big city churches. So, it's easy to talk about like, well, how all Protestant pastors are Joel Osteen and Paula Cain White and T.D. Jakes and Creflo Dollar, when in fact, that's a very small minority of pastors that you're seeing in the Protestant world. A lot of them are just trying to get the word out and get their name out.
Yeah, very good. We're chatting with Matt Swaim about, basically the difference between priests and pastors. Stay tuned. More to come on the other side of the break. This is Hands on Apologetics.
Join VMPR live on YouTube September 12th, 2020 for our latest free conference, The Ultimate Challenge. This exclusive virtual event will feature a brand new talk from Jesse Romero, How Apologetics Brought Me Back to Faith, plus never before broadcast video presentations from Father Mitch Pacwa, Dr. Scott Hahn, and the late great Father Benedict Groeschel.
And the question is, how do you understand the words of Jesus? This is my body, not this bread is my body, but this is my body, this is the cup of my blood. And may I state categorically and emphatically that you cannot understand it. It is a mystery.
Go to vmpr.org to register now and get ready to face the ultimate challenge.
Absolutely mysterious.
Leviticus 11:44 says, "Consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy." St. Vincent Pallotti said, "You must be holy in the way God asks you to be holy." God does not ask you to be a Trappist monk or a hermit. He wants you to sanctify the world and your everyday life. May God show us the path to holiness and help us to follow it all the days of our life.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. We are chatting with the man, the legend, pseudo Matt Swaim, and we're talking about priests and pastors, the difference of it between the two. Actually, you know, Matt, here's a good question. How do denominations understand the idea of clergy differently, or do they all pretty much have the same idea of what a Protestant pastor ought to be?
Well, they definitely don't have all the same idea, that's for sure, because some of them are ordained by the laying on of hands. Some of them just ascend into leadership. Some people have to go to seminary and get a master's of divinity and be appointed by a denomination. Some people can just say, you know what, God told me that I needed to be a preacher, and then they're a preacher the next day. There's a huge variety, and this is why, when it comes to ecumenical dialogue, the Catholic Church is in different kind of levels of dialogue depending on who it is that they're talking to. Like, we have one kind of level with the Orthodox because they have an understanding of the priesthood and the sacraments that is nearly identical to ours. We have a different level with the Anglicans because they have a sense of priesthood and sacraments that looks very similar but is essentially very different than ours. And Lutherans, very similarly. But then everybody else, I mean, it's a grab bag. You can't just you can't have the same kind of ecumenical discussions with a Pentecostal that you can have with someone who's Orthodox, because Pentecostals it may be that someone just was filled with the Holy Spirit and said, I'm called to be the pastor of this place, and then it's their church, as opposed to the Orthodox, who the laying on the hands and apostolic succession. So yeah, it's a very different thing depending on where you're going. And in this age where Christianity, especially evangelical Christianity, is much less denominational than it ever was, then sometimes it can be hard to trace. I mean, I've met people who've been pastors of congregations for 20 years and never been to a lick of grad school, right? Some of them haven't even finished college. It's just, at least some of the ones I met in Kentucky hadn't. It wasn't seen as necessary. But others, good luck getting a pastorate in the Lutheran Church if you don't have some letters behind your name that you worked for.
Yeah. So it could be like a trade, or it could be, white collar, blue collar. It all depends, depending on what perspective you're coming from.
Yeah. Same with a diaconate, depending on denominations, by the way. Yeah. Some people have like rotating diaconates, where you serve like a 2 or 3 year term as a deacon. And I met this lady at the YMCA, and we were hanging out in like one of the chill areas after a workout and got talking. She was a Lutheran deaconess. I don't even think that this was necessarily how our denomination did it, but this is how our congregation did it, that she served a 2 year term and she was in charge of the people whose last names went from S through Z. So as a deacon, she was assigned that part of the alphabetical mailing list to kind of check up on. But her term, would eventually end. It's not like, there's nothing like in the Catholic priesthood. I mean, there are probably denominations that think of it this way, but I've yet to encounter them articulating it the same way. Like that a Catholic priest is a priest forever. They're a sign of like this eschatological reality of what we will all be in the beatific vision. And so he may be a terrible priest. He may have done horrible things. He may be in jail, but he's still a priest. He may not be allowed by his bishop to confect the sacraments, but there's like an indelible mark that was made on his character. He may have been defrocked, as the media likes to call it, but there's like this essential change that happened to him at ordination that is an eternal change. And I don't know that I ever heard it talked about that way in any of my denominations when it came to clergy. But again, I think we take for granted what the word priest implies. It implies sacrifice is part of the job. And that's what is implied in every generation, whether you're, a Baal worshiper or, any kind of pagan, or whether you're a Catholic, or whether you're Orthodox or Anglican. There's an implication that sacrifice is part of the job. That's what the priesthood was established for in Judaism, is to preside over sacrifice. And you take the sacrifice out of your worship, then what's going on up there is not a priestly act. So in a Protestant church, there is no sacrifice at the corner of all of this that's tying the whole worship service together. There may be talk of, laying down your burdens at the foot of the cross, and maybe talking about turning over your life to Jesus. But even in that, it's not like the sense that you're fulfilling in a very concrete sense a form of sacrifice, the way that we are every time we go and receive the Eucharist that is confected on an altar. That's the whole point of an altar. An altar is not just a nice table to hold the book so the priest can hold up his hands and read the right prayers. It's like a place where things die. Like, that's what an altar is.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, and oddly enough, even though the idea of sacrifice is outrightly denied, dogmatically in Protestantism, there still are altars, quote unquote.
Yeah. What's funny is that, so we would have the altar call, depending on, sometimes it would be a revival service and come down to the altar and give your life to Christ. And very often there was not an altar on the stage in the sanctuary, but there would be like rails that you'd kneel. And so the impression I always had was that the altar was like those rails in the front where you knelt. And in a sense, for Protestantism, when you're, if that's where you're going and offering your heart to God, then it makes sense to call that, an altar of sorts. But visually, it looks to us like the altar rail. Now, occasionally you'd have, a communion table brought out for the Lord's Supper in some of the congregations I was part of. But there wasn't this sense that no matter what else happens here, we're going to do a sacrifice today. Yeah. The way that there is in the Catholic faith. I mean, even if you go to a weekday mass and the pastor just reads the gospel, sits down, stands up and says, "All right, time for the petitions." He may not preach anything, but no matter what, there's going to be the tapping into the one holy sacrifice of the mass. If you're a Catholic and you go somewhere else, to another service, it's the first thing that you notice that's like missing, right? When you go to a Protestant church, it's the first thing that you're like, well, we're not done yet. We can't be done yet. He just talked for a while and then we sang a couple songs. You feel that missing element of sacrifice if you're Catholic and you go somewhere else. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of people who come back to us through the Coming Home Network who were Catholic and then went away for sometimes decades. But the thing that drew them back is that they just always felt that element of sacrifice was something that just was a gaping hole, which can only happen with the priest. It can't just happen with, Pastor Bob's Holiness Fun Time show. I mean, he can talk a good game. He can probably teach you some incredible things about the scriptures, but he can't make Jesus Christ present at the sacrament of the altar. No matter how hard he squints, he can't do it. Right. That's an essential difference.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, it's interesting you mentioned that because, as you know, my wife's a revert. She was a fallen away Catholic, became Baptist and Presbyterian, and that was the big thing was, the absence of the Eucharist and the Mass. And ultimately, she had to come to grips with that, and she came back to the church. And Catholics experience that loss. It's funny how, especially if they're not catechized, they don't realize that there is a loss. You know what I mean? They can sense that something's wrong, something's missing, but they just can't put their finger on it.
Yeah. But the priesthood makes sense of certain things in Scripture that it's hard for Protestants to make sense of otherwise. Or at least they were hard for me. So when Jesus breathes on the apostles after the resurrection and says, "Receive the Holy Spirit, whose sins you forgive, they are forgiven, whose sins you retain, they are retained," I would have never thought to myself, well, pastor so-and-so down the street has the ability to forgive or retain my sins. I would have never thought like that. Or when Jesus says to the apostles, do this in remembrance of me. This is my body. This is my blood. And he's pretty specific, and it shows up in 3 of the Gospels, in fairly good detail. And St. Paul writes about it too. You start to wonder, well, how often are we supposed to be doing this? Who's supposed to be in charge of this remembrance service? There's certain things that don't make sense unless you kind of have a vision of the priesthood.
Yeah.
And certain things, when you hear St. Paul talking about, the gift that St. Timothy received in the laying on of hands, that it wasn't just that Paul gave Timothy like his blessing and permission to go preach. There was like a gift that transmitted through that laying on of hands, like a real concrete thing happened in that moment. And there's certain things that just don't make sense without a priesthood. And so various people have tried to understand this in various different denominations about what is meant by this idea of priesthood, because it's obviously spoken about in the New Testament. It's obviously spoken about all the way through the book of Hebrews, especially. And I went to Bible college with a bunch of people from the Salvation Army, and you'll hear this talked about, and Catholics even talk about a portion of this concept, that's the idea of the priesthood of all believers. Like every time we're baptized prophet, priest, and king. Listen for it next time you go see a baby baptized. But the Salvation Army didn't have sacraments. Salvation Army being the denomination of the Salvation Army didn't have sacraments, and so they understood that priesthood was just like, it's everybody just being a witness to the gospel. And when you read through the New Testament, especially if you understand the Old Testament context that underlies all of it, you have to know that Jesus isn't just establishing some, nebulous band of people who are all going to tell people that God loves them. There's actually like some concrete structure to this, and there's concrete leadership, and there's a hierarchy within that leadership, and it has to be apostolic. And then you start paying attention to the things that Jesus commissions the apostles to do, and it's all priestly language. It's all royal language. It's all prophetic language. It's prophet, priest, king stuff kind of all wrapped into one. And to the extent that you and I participate in that and stay connected to that, we can exercise our own priesthood and prophethood and kinghood. But we can't just assume that every passage in the scriptures is meant for every single believer, period. There are offices, and Jesus is clear about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even the Old Testament, Israel was a priestly nation, but you had ministerial priest, you had the high priest, and it's not just terms we stick on. But anyway, I hear the music coming up, Matt. We're chatting with Matt Swaim about the differences between priest and pastor. Stay tuned, folks. More to come on the other side of the ring.
Help the Helpless, a Minnesota St. Paul nonprofit organization chaired by Father of Tyr and volunteers, is humbly asking you for your kind support to help the poor and the handicapped children in India and Ecuador. Through financial support from the Help of the Helpless benefactors, the children are provided with clothing, food, education, shelter, and the teachings of the Catholic Church. The mission is to help children thrive and become self-sufficient young adults leading productive lives. We also provide aid to poor families in Ecuador with food baskets, medicines, medical assistance, and help with funeral needs for the deceased. The work in India is done by Father Antonio's organization, St. Mary's. In Ecuador, the work is being done by the Servant Sisters of the Home of Mother. You can call us at 877-762-8857. To learn more, please visit our website, www.helpthehelpless.org. God bless you.
Hebrews 11:3 says, "By faith we come to understand." According to St. Augustine, understanding is the reward of faith. Therefore, seek not to understand that you may believe, but believe that you may understand. May God grant us a strong living faith in Him and His divine plan of salvation, and help us to believe so that we may understand.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show, and they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
Welcome back, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics, and we are chatting up with Matt Swaim about, the differences between Protestant pastors, Catholic priests, and it's fun to look at both of them, from different angles, because, like you said at the beginning, Matt, Catholics, priesthood, we grew up with priesthood. We might know some things about the priesthood, but it's kind of just part of the air we breathe, right? And it's so foreign for non-Catholics, for many non-Catholics.
And it's so misunderstood even by Catholics as to what it is that you need to be a priest. There's a sense in some circles that it should be for, it's a leadership church, a leadership position in the church, just like any other leadership position in any other kind of organization. Therefore, anybody should be able to apply and get the job, except that's not how it works. That's not how Jesus set it up. That's not how, I don't think it's probably how I would have set it up if I were Jesus, but thankfully to God, I am not. It's a very specific kind of thing. And there's an objective reality to the nature of the priesthood that kind of is at the core of the whole sacramental system that Jesus established. So we can't have a valid Eucharist or valid confessions unless we've got a priest, but we can't have that priest unless we had a bishop to appoint him. And we can't have that guy unless they, through the gift of the laying on the hands from somebody all the way back, touched somebody who touched somebody going back to the apostles, did that. As a matter of fact, the Pope doesn't even do us any good unless he's a priest who's been touched by all those people, all the way back. It's this essential character that carries through, and there's an objective reality to it. St. John Vianney has a wonderful, just marvelous catechesis on the priesthood. And I just want to read a couple pieces from it to give you an idea of how the objective reality of the priesthood is just something mysterious and other that it can be so easy to take for granted. John Vianney says this. He says, "Go to confession to the Blessed Virgin or to an angel. Will they absolve you? No. Will they give you the body and blood of our Lord? No. The Holy Virgin cannot make her divine Son descend into the host. You might have 200 angels there, but they could not absolve you. A priest, however simple he may be, can do it. He can say to you, 'Go in peace, I pardon you.'" Not even the Virgin Mary can consecrate the Eucharist, is what St. John Vianney is saying.
Right.
Yeah. But no matter how much of a simpleton the priest down the street is, he can say those words of consecration and it happens. Yeah. That's wild. What a trust. What a mind-blowing thing for Jesus to risk by instituting the priesthood. Yeah. That it would be run by fools and clowns charged with handling his sacred body and blood, charged with absolution. And with that, St. John Vianney goes on to say that when people wish to destroy religion, they begin by attacking the priest, because when there is no longer any priest, there is no sacrifice. And when there is no longer any sacrifice, there is no religion. And I think that's easy for us to forget, that's essentially what sets religion apart from just like a random code of ethics, that there's sacrifice at the heart of it. And to have sacrifice, you need a priest to preside over that sacrifice. You even maybe need to preside over it in your own priestly role by offering your life as a living sacrifice, as St. Paul tells us in Romans 12. But that core element of sacrifice that's at the heart of all religion, even pagan religion, this isn't just Father so-and-so who is supposed to tell us a couple of nice things on Sunday, then we go up and, get the Eucharist we deserve and go home to our week. No, there's like a life and death and eternity are up on that altar because there's a priest standing over it, trusted with the mysteries of Jesus Christ. I mean, that's not what's happening at like Harvest Community Fellowship, Gary. They might be getting some good songs in. They might be hearing some fantastic scriptural exposition, but there's not something that's not the same thing that's happening over there.
Yeah, it's earth moving. If you think about it, that Christ's body, blood, soul, and divinity becomes present, at the words of that are spoken through the priest. Of course, he's spoken because it's not merely his words, right? He's speaking in persona Christi. So Christ is present, in the priest in a very special way in Mass. Like you said, there's just no parallels outside the church to that.
Yeah, and when he says, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven, he's basically giving them that authority. He's not giving everybody the authority. I mean, I can't just walk down the street and be like, you know what? Speed limit's not 35 anymore, it's 55. Whatever I bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. That's not, I mean, Jesus is obviously speaking to a specific group of people about a specific role. And of course you can go back and do the typology and see how, just like the 12 tribes of Israel, he's got the 12 apostles and all the imagery associated with that, and how Jesus, is fulfilling with that, even just what was going on with God, appointing a certain group of people to, with the Levites, that this is what you do. Not just anybody can go up there and perform the sacrifice. You're set apart. And we may be not taking sheep to church and slaughtering them up front anymore because Christ fulfilled that sacrifice. But that priesthood from back then was meant to be a sign of what we would receive when we, received Christ into human history, and he became the ultimate sacrifice. Sacrifice not at the heart of most Protestant worship, let's just say.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I was going to say that's radically different from Protestantism, because the priesthood is, like you said, so important because he has these faculties that you just can't bring on yourself. It's given to you through the apostolic succession. For Protestantism, is the pastor really, I mean, what role does he play in terms of the congregation's salvation? Or does he play a role?
I mean, this is where it gets real muddy, depending on who you are and who's preaching. And, for instance, in Reformed theology, there you've got the elect, and God chose them. And it has nothing to do with anything except for the sovereignty of God and God's reasons for choosing. I mean, in the early days of the Reformation, the missionary stuff was not a thing because, the elect were the elect. God already picked the people. It's less that way now, obviously, although in certain neo-Calvinist circles you hear that. But, in my particular tradition, which was very focused on free will and the free response to God's grace, there was kind of that whole woe to me if I do not preach the gospel aspect of Scripture, that, who's going to be the one to tell, people that they need to come to Christ? You have a responsibility. Every individual believer does. And in a sense, the pastor functioned like a general in that way. And it's not completely unlike what goes on in Mass, where you rally the troops and then you send them out to sanctify the world. The difference being that you rally the troops, you feed them with the body and blood of Christ, and you send them out to sanctify the world. Whereas, in my experience, it would be you rally them, you give them a good word to help them understand, how to live their faith in the workplace or the school or whatever for the week. There was nothing, I would say, that was in opposition to the Catholic idea of here's where you gather, here's where you're strengthened, and then you go out and you share. There just was that missing element of a sacrifice. You were there for edification. You were there to learn. You were there for fellowship. You were there to pray. But if you didn't get that edification there, or if you didn't get some good fellowship there, if you didn't learn something there, you could say, you know what? We'll switch channels next week. We'll go down the street.
Yeah.
We landed in specific places when I was growing up after a while, but, during the discernment process, when you're trying to figure out where to go, it's like, well, am I being fed here? There wasn't any kind of like objective reality. The objective reality was that the Bible is true, but is this guy doing a good job telling us about that? Yeah. He's not. Let's go somewhere else. Catholics don't really have that option.
Right. That's a huge burden, I imagine, for a pastor, that you're only as good as your last sermon. And what's interesting, it's almost, I don't want to say it's Pelagian, but it's weird that you would think somehow somebody could be saved if you get somebody who can really articulate the gospel well. When, God can affect salvation like St. Paul, right? No one intervened in his case. Christ appeared, or they could see a holy image, or, meet a holy person. But that's I think a very heavy burden, isn't it, too?
Yeah. What's funny is that, we would hear people who are particularly gifted at preaching the gospel sometimes, and this wasn't necessarily a characteristic specifically of my own congregation, but it is of more Pentecostal and charismatic leaning congregations. They would say if someone has a really gifted preaching ministry, they'd say that person's anointed. That music leader, he's anointed. Guess what? Every priest is anointed, like literally. Before the stuff on their hands, they're like laying on the floor, like they're actually anointed. But yeah, it was kind of one of those, the idea being they were anointed with the Holy Spirit and had this gift that flowed out of them, which they may have had, and most of the people I heard were very gifted speakers and preachers and teachers. But if public speaking skills are all it takes, you can fake that pretty well. We're in an election year. Look at all the public speakers we have who are running commercials during my baseball games or ruining my fun, right? They're all gifted public speakers. Well, to lesser and greater extents. But, just being able to command attention of a crowd it's not proof that what you're teaching is truth. It's proof that people like to hear you talk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so we see congregations that are, pack out arenas with fluff, but it's fluff that people want to hear.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's yeah. And the funny thing is, I can see that our time is already. Boy, that hour flew. We've only scratched the surface too on the differences between the Protestant pastor and priest. But I wanted to take a few minutes just to kind of plug your what you're doing at the Coming Home Network, what you're doing with Ken.
Sure. So Ken and I are going through. Ken's a former pastor, Baptist pastor from California, and he and I are going through right now Sola Fide and digging into that Reformation doctrine of faith alone and having some fun with it. Especially digging into the letters of St. Paul and what he says about faith and works. And I would encourage people to go to chnetwork.org to see not just our series on the journey with Matt and Ken, but stories of Protestant pastors who become Catholic priests and hear them articulate these differences better than I ever. chnetwork.org.
Yeah, very good. Well, Matt, hey, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. And the website, chnetwork.org. And the hour has flown, but never fear. Terry and Jesse will soon be here with the Terry and Jesse Show. Thank you so much for listening. God willing, we'll be back tomorrow to do this thing we call Hands on Apologetics. Bye-bye, everybody.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood. But when my wife Betty's mom took ill, we relocated to Orange County. And it was during this time in our lives that I converted to Catholicism. Once my eyes were opened to the truth, I couldn't learn enough about the faith. But I had less free time than ever, especially with a long commute. That's when I discovered the real value of Catholic audio. Listening to cassette tapes transformed my daily commute into a miniature retreat. And that's the beauty of Virgin Most Powerful Radio today. Since the podcasts are archived, you can listen anytime on our smartphone app. I know how listening to Catholic audio can bring you closer to Christ and His Church, So I encourage you to visit the App Store or go to vmpr.org and download the app today. It just might change your life. I'm Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio.